Hey, Sean, welcome to the Get in the Mode podcast.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me.
Sean, I know we met at the peer group, and your talk was amazing. So I enjoyed it. So I thought I'll invite you. For the benefit of our listeners and viewers, can you give us an introduction of yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a professor at the University of Rochester, adjunct professor. I teach a culture of innovation, which really came out of my almost 30 years of developing software products for a living. I've got a company with some partners called ITX, and we have a couple hundred employees. We build custom software products for other firms. So if you think about it, we have customers who hire us to build software products. Every one of them is unique, bespoke. So it requires a lot of creativity, it requires a lot of innovation. And that's basically what I go around speaking to leaders about. It's how to create a culture that fosters innovation.
Yeah. So I've got several topics for us today. The first one I want to start with is that talk that you gave at that peer group about trust, right? And levels of trust. What struck me was, we always talk about trust, but I think you had defined several levels. Maybe we'll kind of, I know the three different levels that you talked about. In your mind, if you were to kind of break it down, what does that look like?
Yeah, well, it's really relationships. And I believe that when you're building a software product or you're running a business in the broader scope of things, the goal is to maximize the relationships that you produce with the people that you're serving. Even if you're building a widget, like an iPhone, for example, if you're building a cell phone, the goal is to get people in the community that love the product so much that they advocate for it, so to speak. So I look at the relationships that we're able to build as an entity, as an organization, as a product, as the ultimate goal of the product or the organization. And I like to think of relationships as having some granularity, like there's levels of relationships. And the first sort of fundamental level of a relationship is trust, right? So you have trust when there's a confidence relationship. Like I have confidence in you, you have confidence in me. There's you're competent and you care enough about me that there's a reason I should be maybe leveraging your tools or engaging with your org. Next level up is loyalty. So it starts with trust. When you have trust over a period of time, that turns into loyalty. When you have loyalty over a longer period of time, hopefully that turns into advocacy. And again, these are just words that I've chosen to represent different levels of this thing called a relationship. Trust, loyalty, advocacy being the ultimate form of a relationship between an organization and the people that it leads, like its customers and its employees. We talk about this internally as well as externally. So, and I think it's important to have granularity in how you look at relationships. You can say, yeah, we have a relationship or we don't. That's not as helpful as, hey, there's levels of a relationship. Let's look at them granularly. Trust, loyalty, advocacy, that's a good way to break it down. And if we can look at the behaviors associated with each of those levels, it becomes something very tactile, something that we could measure and have metrics around. If we have those metrics, we'll know we're being successful strategically at building these relationships. And that's another part of the discussion is, organizations exist historically in a capitalistic environment to make a profit. And we know that if they don't make a profit, they don't exist for very long. They don't live.
Right.
So I consider that the tactics, like the tactical success is our ability to make a profit. But the strategic success, which is really much longer term, a much longer horizon, is about how capable the product, the service, the organization is at building relationships with the people that it exists to serve and the people that are building it and servicing it. So that's the basis of the framework.
You mentioned observability of these behaviors. That was also something that was kind of an eye opener for me. I think we know this as common sense as business owners and leaders, but it's just that we don't kind of think about it like, hey, what level is this relationship in that way, right? Can you talk about some behaviors that you can observe at these various levels? I mean, these are potentially examples, and I think you even talk about that it's unique for each business, but I'm curious, what are some behaviors that people can observe?
Sure. I actually don't think it's unique. It's the language around it that's unique, right? So
Got it.
think about when you advocate for something, and
Yeah.
I choose my words very carefully, right? So I'm choosing the word advocate. So let's define what I mean when I say advocate, because there's a lot of definitions for the word advocate floating out there. If you're an attorney, it means something very different than if you're working in software, or if you're a service organization. So when I use the word advocate, what I mean is we have customers and potentially employees, but let's focus on the customers for now because that's easier for us to wrap our head around, who invest in our collective future. They invest in our collective future. What does that mean? So I figured this out years ago. Like, you can't build a great software product, like a truly great software product, without a community of people who care about the success of that product. Not just the people who are going to make money from it, but also the people that are using it to get value, to derive value in their lives. So, as a software leader, specifically, you need beta testers who actually care about the success of the product, that are going to give you constructive, powerful feedback that you can act on, not just complain, that are going to give you positive feedback so you can fuel your culture. That positive feedback, you need it and as a leader, as you start to recognize how important these behaviors are from the people that derive value from your services. It's like you said, it's an eye opener, and these are observable behaviors. You'll never get the observation perfect, and
Sure.
you'll have. So I've done this. Yeah, I've done this with lots of firms. It turns out you're going to be wrong with your metrics, but that's okay, because you're still moving in the right direction, and you're having conversations in the wild, even when the leader's not in the room, right? Around what it means to turn our customers into advocates. Again, by my definition, meaning they're investing in our collective future with us. And we want to maximize the number of those folks and the depth at which they're behaving in that way in our customer ecosystem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And would you recommend, us reciprocating, certain behaviors depending on where they are and what level they are? How do you, what are your recommendations for us? Like, let's say client exhibits a level of trust versus a level of advocacy. Like, what are some recommendations for, the person who's providing that service or that leader that is working with the client?
Well, so the goal is to get as many people up to the advocacy level as possible. I know from experience, you'll never get there, but that's the goal. So it's like an aspirational goal. You want to maximize the number of advocates in your customer ecosystem. Yeah. Loyalty is a good thing, and so is trust. So if you see trust behaviors, confidence behaviors, loyalty is about engagement, regular, ongoing, recurring engagement. Those are good things. You just want more, and you want more people getting to that advocacy level over time.
Yeah.
So I think the starting point is you just have to get to a point where you have you have a system for tracking these observations of behaviors, and then you can refine it over time to try to get more of it. And to answer your first question there about reciprocation, I think by default most leaders know this, and they do this. Like, you know who your pool of top customers are, and you take good care of them. That's called being an advocate in return, right? So, and just like with trust, you're not going to get trust if you don't give trust. Right. You won't get loyalty unless you give loyalty, and you're not going to get advocacy unless you give advocacy. And like, you're not going to get people to invest in your collective future unless you're investing in their collective future. And you get this advocacy when you listen to them, when you're authentic with them, when you celebrate together, when you do things to promote the telling of the story of you working together. That's the holy grail of a business relationship.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think having that aspiration strives for deepening of relationships, right? If you don't have that, you're just going to be like, I think the relationship never gets to a point where it's beyond transactional stuff, right? Like, oh, I paid you for this, you need to get this done for me, kind of thing. Um, so yeah, I think one kind of follow up that comes to my mind is like the particularity of the articulation and the words that we use, and how we define it. uh, you are very meticulous about that. I'm curious, where is that coming from? Yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts on why
Well,
are you so particular?
well, I believe that. So if you look at the great leaders of history, right, that caused great change to occur, the Mahatma Gandhis of the world, the Nelson Mandelas, the Martin Luther Kings, the John F. Kennedy put a man on the moon. I mean, in the context of great leaders and great leadership, you look across generations, across races, across gender, across all sorts of demographic factors. And these folks all had one single tool in common: their ability to communicate, their ability to use words. And words, in the words of Chalmers brothers, who wrote the book Language in the Pursuit of Happiness, and also Language in the Pursuit of Leadership Excellence, one of my good friends and heroes, Chalmers says that words and language create action. And as a leader, if you want to scale action, the only way to scale it is through the words that you use. So I think, so if you take a step back from your business or your organization or your team, whatever it is you lead, take a step back and you look at, what are the really important words here that, if we are specific and purposeful with them, will help us be more powerful as leaders? What's the set of shared terminologies that informs our culture that will help us succeed together? And there are words like trust, right? Like, fundamental word. If you're going to operate together as a team, what do you mean when you say the word trust? And I do this exercise with leaders all the time. Have them all write down their definition of trust, and then share it. I have a conversation about it. It's amazing how differently we use the word. Right. So if we're going to use it together, we can take our individual context and set it aside and come up with a definition, a clear, clean, crisp definition with behaviors that we could observe that will indicate, hey, we've earned trust because we can see these behaviors in the wild. We'll be wrong. It won't be perfect. It certainly won't be right, but it'll be useful. It'll be useful and it'll be powerful because we'll have better shared distinction around this word trust. And people will, they'll put who doesn't want to be trustworthy, right? So when you have a group definition for the word trust and you're all working towards that, everybody just inherently wants to achieve that thing. So it's been a powerful set of distinctions for me.
I want to slightly shift gears and talk a little bit about strategy. Maybe break down your sort of like what's your perspective on innovation? Because I think you're a big proponent of culture of innovation, fostering such environments. I'm curious for how do you, maybe we'll start with the definition of innovation. Like what does that mean to you? And we'll kind of go from there.
Definition of innovation. All right, so we'll start with the definition of innovation, and we'll go backwards. We'll talk about strategy. All right, so I define innovation as any tactic, idea, or process change that when we deploy it, it causes a change in relationship, causes a change, a shift in what I call momentum. So you see a change in the relationship between the consumer, and again, this internally as a company, this could be an employee, it could be customer, it could be an investor, but it causes a change in the relationship. And you'll know you have it when you see that change. And if you're measuring for trust and loyalty and advocacy, you'll see that shift. And I think it's a mistake to say that innovation, it's not an innovation if it's not the iPhone. If it's not disruptive, It's not an innovation. Like, not everybody on your team is capable of creating those types of innovations. So that's like immediately you're setting yourselves up for being disappointed and having, failing to innovate. I think the small ones matter. I think the small ones add up. And I think if everybody's thinking about innovation, if everybody's thinking about how can I improve the relationship that I have strategically with this customer, with my colleagues, with the business, you're going to get micro innovations, and you're going to get more energy around looking for those innovations. And it turns out, creativity comes from motivation. It comes from intrinsic motivation. And when people are highly intrinsically motivated to do a thing, they're thinking about it not just when they're sitting at their desk. They're thinking about it all the time. Like, I think Archimedes in the bathtub, right? Like, we never know when that spark of insight's going to hit us that we could bring back to the office and try. And I think it's important to encourage people to be, first of all, they have good goals, like goals that matter to people, goals like trust, loyalty, and advocacy, so that you have that sort of back of mind thinking going on around what's really strategically important. And you'll get more innovations. All right, so that's innovation. Now, strategy, I see, we talked about this a little bit earlier. I see strategic goals as those goals that show us that we're moving the needle on the human relationship. Tactical goals add up so that we end up with more of a profit. And I draw my momentum framework in two clear swim lanes. One's around tactics, right? One's around tactics, which is deploying capabilities to produce a thing or a product or a service in the world so that we make a profit, we make a return on our investment. Whereas strategy is the coordination and orientation of human beings. Like, here's what our goal is: to improve relationships by knowing who these people are that we can serve, what problems we can solve for them, and how we're going to measure our strategic success. And then coupling that with language that helps us motivate people towards that vision. And the income for strategy is the ideas, things to test, things to go out in the world and test that are new and different. So that's how I see strategy. It's the orientation of people, whereas tactics is the orientation of things so that we can actually make a profit and have sustainability.
What's sort of like the connecting, the connecting thread between strategy and innovation? Like, I understand the swim lanes. I'm curious to hear your views on, if you were to say, hey, this is where strategy is and this is where innovation. How are they connected?
I wish I had the diagram to draw, but you can flip the diagram.
I'm going to share that on my, if you don't mind. I've seen your presentation. I'm going to share that in my show notes, but perhaps we can, talk through that.
So the fabric that ties everything together is culture, and Peter Drucker's famous, although there's no evidence that he actually said it, he's famous for saying strategy eats culture for breakfast. I don't agree with that. I think culture is distinct from strategy. It's the language that we use to bring our strategy to life through our tactics, and it underlies everything we do. So culture is, when you boil it down, it's the language that we use. It's the values, not only the ones that we define and write on the walls, but the ones that we actually live and use, that have mantras associated with them, that have stories that get told within the organization, that have metrics. Our metrics are a key part of our culture because what gets measured gets managed, right? And ultimately, the art that is our business. Like, these are the layers of culture, and it's when you see it drawn out that way, it's not so complicated, and it's so important that I think it has to be treated independently of culture, or independently of strategy and of our tactics. The culture is its own thing. It's important. The bigger you get, the more important it is as a firm. It's largely
kind of like if you're making a peanut butter jelly sandwich, is the peanut butter and the jelly is the culture. Without that, the sandwich doesn't taste good.
That's right. That's exactly right.
I'm maybe talk a little bit about how can leaders develop culture? Let's say we want to define the organization culture. Like, what are some good exercises, or where does one begin? Let's start there.
Well, let's start with where one begins. Every group of 2 or more people has a culture. So we have to acknowledge that. So there's a
Yeah.
culture, it exists. Even if you're starting from scratch, you have a culture. It exists in the way that you share language. It exists in the stories that you tell and the mantras that you have, and that's how you start. So if you want to grow a company or an organization purposefully, with one of the things you have to work on is culture. And you're doing this whether you realize it or not, because every culture has the exact culture that it needs to produce the results it's getting today. If you want different results, then you look at the culture and you change it. But I think it's a misnomer to think that you can control your culture. You can't.
Mm. Mm.
You can't. Then the bigger you get, the harder it becomes to have any influence over it. The only thing you can do as a leader is influence the culture, and you have that because all eyes are on you. The higher up in the org you are, the eyes are on you. You model the behaviors, you model the language, you model the mantras, you model the things that become copied, hopefully, that are positive, and you amplify them. So it's your job to influence the culture and to recognize that you can't control it.
So are they like organization values that, how some companies have them sort of like plastered around the walls of the company? Like, do you recommend creating sort of like a document like that can be socialized within the organization? How do you sort of like quantify it? Like, how do you make it tangible?
Yeah, so the great question, and I think you absolutely should define your corporate values. I believe in the rule of fives. My partners and I have come up with 5 key values that we think are important. I believe that if you feel they're important, you do a bunch of things with these values. The first thing you do is you onboard people to them. So when you hire new people, they have some training that you put them through, so they see what you mean when you say this word. You take the time to define each value very clearly. So maybe a 1-page definition with examples of what you mean when you say that value, so that there's a clear expectation set. You model those values yourself as the leader. You build it into your performance management system. So if you've got a way in which you're assessing the values and the performance of your people, you incorporate it into that, and we've done that very successfully in the past. And then you build it into your recognition systems. So if you have a praise system or some sort of recognition system, it's based, values can get tagged in there. The more pervasive it is, and also in your cadences. So you have, every business has a set of cadences. You have stand-ups, daily, weekly, monthly. You have all staff meetings, all of those things. Find ways to incorporate your values into those cadences, and then also into your artifacts. So if you have corporate artifacts that you put out, like your website, or other documents or things that you do that have an impact on the culture, leverage your values in those conversations as well, and in those artifacts. And the more of that you do, the more solidified those things become. They become tools. Like, the values are only useful if they can be used to make decisions in the wild when you're not in the room as the leader. That's when they're useful. Mm-hmm. So in order to make them useful, you have to demonstrate that you care about them. You have to model that behavior, and you have to put systems in place that sort of replicate the storytelling and give people the opportunities to actually use the values. Make sense?
For smaller organizations that are sort of like developing culture per se, I mean, like you said, when 2 or 3 people come together and they're working together on a common goal, there's culture. It starts showing up, right? Where does one begin to start creating those artifacts? In a bigger company, it's sometimes already there. They need to, revise and refine that as they grow, perhaps. But I'm curious, where does one start for smaller organizations?
Well, personally, I think I would start with creating a distinction around what's important to your organization, which is, always your customer, right? Customer is the source of all your revenue and all the value. They're the ones that derive the value from the services or products that you produce. So my personal recommendation is, if you're going to start with one thing, start with figuring out what you're going to call your advocates, call them ambassadors, promoters, evangelists, whatever you want to call them, product, whatever. Just don't call them net promoters. That's another talk. That's another podcast episode.
Right.
But figure out what you're going to call them, and then figure out how you're going to know that they're an advocate, because that's the meaning of your business, is to produce as many of those people as possible. And then I believe once you have that defined and articulated, and you've got some behavioral metrics so you can see it happening in the wild, it's going to become easier for you to find people that can help, that can sign up to help you go create more of those, employees, people to help you, vendors, partners, things like that. So that'd be my recommendation as a place to start.
Yeah, that I'm kind of slightly pushing this topic here. What would you say about one's own identity? So, for example, as 3 becomes 5, 5 becomes 10, as the company, small size company grows, there's an internal identity that is also happening. There's advocacy, maybe clients are moving up the trust ladder, from trust to loyalty to advocacy, and they're kind of sharing sort of like your values to the external world, and you're kind of listening to them and learning that. I'm curious, how do you align the two? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Is there such a thing, or do we kind of have to define our values based on what is reflected back to us from our clients?
So I think the answer is yes, and when you're smaller, you're more adaptable. It's easier to change things, right?
Yes.
So again, yes, and like,
yeah,
you should define your values. You should work on them, and you should also be willing to adapt them at any time. If they're not working, or they need to be changed, or you need to change the language that you use to describe them, by all means, you should be doing that. And when you're small, it's easier. It's much easier to make those changes. The bigger you get, the more harder it is to make those changes, and the more particular you need to be about how those changes get implemented. So yes, I do think there's some back and forth, some give and take, some paying attention to what's going on in your ecosystem and seeing what's working, what's not working, and adapting.
Yeah. It's sort of like, if you want to call it agile, right. Well, let's kind of dive into some of your journey in all of this, right? As always, I'm curious about, like, how did you get into this, kind of going beyond just kind of business and, hey, profitability and all of that, right? And strategy and things like that. How did you get into this world of learning about customers, trust and relationships and things like that? What's your personal journey?
Yeah, well, I guess I would make the argument that it happened out of necessity, because building a custom software development shop, as you know, it's hard. It's challenging. There's a lot of highly paid, highly creative, very intelligent people on all sides of the equation. You got people with bags of money that want to spend it, that have to be very careful with it, and they've got to report to their supervisor, to the people that own the bags of money, and then you got to use that money to pay a bunch of people to build a thing that no one's ever seen before. You're going to deploy it to the wild, and a bunch of people that you have never met are going to use it. So you have all these people, all with different expectations. And if we don't figure out how to get people aligned, confident, and committed to what we're doing, it's going to turn out to be a failure, 99% of the time. So in order to be successful, to find success in that business, I had to figure this thing out. So
so do you ever use any of these in your personal relationships, like even outside of work?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of reading.
The
trust framework in general is based on a lot of it's based on John Gottman's work, Brene Brown's work, Charles Feltman in the business world, Stephen Covey, Stephen M.R. Covey. There's a lot of really good research out there on trust, how it's formed, how you might measure it, those sorts of things. Of course, you're going to use those in the building of personal relationships as well. And, I think the way I see the world, an organization exists to build trust, loyalty, advocacy with its employees and with its customers, with its investor community, and even with its vendors and partners, right? There are higher levels of a relationship beyond advocacy. They're just not applicable necessarily to a business. There's very few people in the world that are going to actually tattoo a Harley Davidson thing on their shoulder. You know what I mean? Like that's a level that most businesses will never get to, and that's okay. So yeah, I think all of the lessons here are pertinent to interpersonal relationships, family relationships, friendships, of course.
I feel like obviously the lessons learned from the business world spills over into your personal life, and obviously you can also bring some of the good lessons you've learned into your professional life as well.
For sure.
What are some things that you're looking forward to in fall?
I'm working real hard on sort of the tactical output part of the momentum framework. So I'm really looking at flow and execution, team execution. How do we make sure we optimize for keeping our teams in a maximum state of flow, and helping people find more happiness through our work, figuring out how to stratify our goals across different time horizons. Anyway, that's the stuff I'm working on now.
Okay. Yeah. Is that something that you're going to share to the public, or is it kind of going to be more internally tested first? And
yeah, for sure. I'm on Medium. You can find me there. The Sean Flaherty on Medium, and I'm always publishing stuff that I'm working on. It's all in the public domain. So great question.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about kind of some books that you've read lately within the last 1 year or so. What are some books that kind of surprised you, or something worth mentioning?
Noise by Daniel Kahneman.
Okay.
About all the errors that we make every single day in every one of our decisions. It's pretty spectacular and pathetic. So I think having a really good handle on sort of our own cognitive biases is an ongoing struggle for anybody who's actually human. Along the lines of flow, I went back and reread Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's most of his books. I went back and reread. He's amazing. And probably one of the most impactful things this year has been Tal Ben-Shahar's work on happiness out of Harvard. He had the most popular lecture at Harvard ever.
I'm curious about that one. Like what if you were to distill a few key points, what would those be?
He's got a really great framework in there around short-term versus long-term happiness.
Okay.
And his discovery is basically, as an athlete, had his eye on the prize of being the best of the best in this specific sport. And then when he achieved it, he realized he'd missed out on years of his life as he looks at his friends and how they've been living their lives and having fun, and how you can achieve something incredible and be completely depressed. Why is that? And that doesn't just focusing on the long term, delaying gratification doesn't work. And then on the flip side of that, hedonism doesn't work either. Like just living for the moment, like sex, drugs, rock and roll, right? That doesn't work. So we know it fulfills our immediate needs, but then we wake up in the morning and our life has passed us by and we haven't accomplished anything of value in the world. So finding the right balance. Anyway, that's the key.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have to.
He's got a pretty cool hamburger model and a 4-quadrant model that's neat to look at.
It sounds very similar to, I don't know if you've read Clayton Christensen's How Will You Measure Your Life? It's sounds very, Clayton Christensen talks about, he's Harvard professor. So he
he does.
goes to the alumni and he talks about how all these alumni folks, either some of them are in jail or some of them are going through bad relationships and, failures and things like, or, hopefully they, kind of retrospection and things like that. So it's very interesting that what is that? Is it available on the public domain or is that a book? If we were to dive into that happiness framework that you were talking about.
Well, Tal Ben-Shahar's framework is available. You can Google that. He wrote the book Happier. And positive psychology has been around for quite a while. If you're interested in that, Martin Seligman and his work. My favorite in the positive psychology domain is self-determination theory. So Why We Do What We Do by Ed Deci.
Okay.
He's the University of Rochester professor. Deci and Ryan have the self-determination theory framework, which is incredible. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Sean, I really enjoyed this conversation. Hope to have you again. So thanks for being on the Get in the Mode podcast.
No worries. Thank you, David. Appreciate you.
Before we kind of wrap up, maybe if you want to kind of say, where can folks find you? I know you mentioned Medium to look. Yeah, but if there are other ways to reach you. Yeah,
I'm also Sean Flaherty, ITX on LinkedIn. You can find me there. Yeah, and if you want any information or have any questions about any of the stuff that I'm working on, I'm always open, eager to share. So
thanks, Sean.
Thank you, David.